Okay, boys, this is NJ from the MBTI tier lists. The time has come to simply do it and determine in these episodes like which MBTI personality type would be the greatest and unquestionably the best soldier. Now, when we're talking about a soldier, we're basically just talking about like a random soldier, like in war, like in a war zone. Whether it is like urban war zone or urban warfare or in the forests or in the hills or in the mountains or in the desert or where the fuck. Like you have an assault rifle in your hands, you have packed your backpack for the day and gone to war with your mates. Just like it's happening in around the world as we speak, as horrible as it might sound. So yeah, let's start with the obvious, the NFs in war. So what about the ENFJ? So the ENFJ, I know that the ENFJ would be the suckiest soldier. They do have like 30 SE. I actually even did like FE would help them even just like a little bit, you know. FE makes you pay attention to people. You would be a team player. You would notice what your mates are doing around you. And you could like, you know, you could kind of like work with your mates. You would be good at cooperating and doing team shit, and you would be highly aware of what everybody's doing and why and about everybody's personalities, and you would be able to assess and estimate human outcomes. And that third theory, SE, you know, would give you some modicum of capacity in behaving and acting in a chaotic physical environment, shooting and running and crouching and, you know, jumping behind the crates or something. And noticing stuff in your environment and so on. That being said, I do like ENFJs fundamentally are still a pretty like an abstract type. They're one of the least abstract types of the intuitives with their FESE combo. Unfortunately, the way that ENFJs are not abstract has to do with people because it's with the FESE combo. So ENFJs, they do kind of like live in reality, but they live in the reality of people, not in the reality of bullets and physical environment as it is. So I don't think they would be the greatest. I don't like ENFJs would probably be like talented for being a soldier. I think they could be feasible soldiers. I think they could get the job done. Whether they are B tier or S tier, it's kind of like debatable. You know, ENFJs, yeah. That's like a really hard one, you know. B tier is kind of like you can totally do it, and so a C tier is like you have like a little bit of a weakness for it, so to speak. Yeah, like maybe you just have to give them the B tier, because of the third tier SE. You know, I'm not sure like if ENFJs are like known for their like physical prowess. I'm not sure if they're like known for being the most nimble guys or anything, but I think they could like by all means they should be able to kind of like hang in there or something. But that FE, it's just like it gets in the way so much that secondary NI makes them super abstract. Some ENFJs do have super strong SEs, and if you were a soldier, you would be developing it, and it's like a function that you can actually develop. So I'd like ENFJs. Yeah, I think they could be B tier by just developing the SE. Okay, INFJ. Now we actually have a record of an INFJ going to war as a soldier, Hitler. Yes, guys, before Hitler became mein Führer, like Hitler, like he was actually like a random foot soldier in war. And it took Hitler exactly 2 weeks to be shot in the ass and be sent into the medical bay. Now, the question is, why was that? That was because Hitler was an INFJ, and I don't want to be a dick here, but let's face the facts here, guys, like INFJs suck as soldiers. Hitler was one of the most brilliant politicians in history. He got the Germans to all become racists within a few years, you know, and got them to think that it would be a feasible idea to just like gas chamber the Jews. You know? Which is like, you have to be a talented politician to be able to turn your people who were by all means a reasonable folk before Hitler entered the scene and became their Mein Führer. You have to be one hell of a politician to be able to take all of your people and just like turn them all into complete sociopaths within a few years. That is not to say that like I would say anything about like the actual, you know, principles that governed Hitler. Like we're not like making a moral judgment here. We're talking about people's competence levels in what they're doing. Okay, this is the MBTI tier lists. Okay. So INFJs would probably and basically for all intents and purposes be the worst soldier in the entire system. They're leading with NI, which is probably the worst function to be leading in with for war. Their secondary function, FE, makes them just like pay attention to people. It doesn't give them any further physical awareness of anything. You know, their tertiary TI only makes them even more abstract. They have inferior SE and polar TE. These are the two executional functions of the system, which they have none as an INFJ. INFJ is the most abstract type, the most uptight type when it comes to physical reality. INFJs are completely out of it. They are not aware of physical environment, and they certainly cannot operate in a fluid fashion in a chaotic physical environment where everything is going to shit. Surprising things are happening. You can't plan your way through anything. INFJs are planners. That main NI function makes them planners. INFJs do not like surprises. And in war, there is nothing but. Okay, INFJs are not talented physically. They are not great in sports. They're not great at shooting. Literally everything that would be required of a soldier, the INFJ should, by all means, based on their functional stacking, suck ass. And Hitler failing it as a foot soldier is a perfect example of INFJs in war. I would not recommend an INFJ to go to war. You're just gonna die. You're gonna cry, and then you're gonna die. Okay? Just if you're an INFJ, do not go there. Okay? So what about the INFPs? So INFPs, I mean, like they're leading with FI. It kind of like gives them very little to war per se. But that secondary NE, you know, that is an explorative function. So INFPs are curious about the environment, and NE is curious even about physical environments, and NE is an observational function. So NE does notice stuff in real time, on the fly, in the environment. I like INFPs can be surprisingly clever and witty, and they can be surprisingly nimble. And I like INFPs can be surprisingly capable in maneuvering themselves through chaos when they just like get into that like NE modes. Tertiary SI, they actually do have a sensing function. Like the war happens in physical reality. But INFPs, they have a polar SE, so they are kind of oblivious to like the physical environment in like an objective way. INFPs only see the patterns in their surroundings and the laws and the principles, and they can only connect the dots, but they can't like really see what's actually there. They have an inferior TE, which makes them completely incapable of kind of like following direct and simple linear commands and executing them in physical reality. INFPs would be the kind of a clever guy who might come up with some stunt that they might be able to pull off by themselves, but INFPs would have a really poor capability in understanding the military tactics. And they would always be out of sync as a soldier with the rest of the team and so on. That they would be like really bad at like positioning themselves like with the team. You know, this like inferior TE and polar SE would lead into such things that they like an INFP as a singular soldier. I like INFPs would be way better like snipers than, you know, foot soldiers in a platoon. You know, INFPs, they can only be successful if you really just like let them go their own way. Then they might be able to come up with something clever. But in a war scenario, you have to work as a team and you know, produce military tactics and strategy and that kind of stuff. And INFPs, they would have a severe weakness there. You know, in guerrilla warfare, once again, INFPs would be better if they got to sneak in the forest by themselves and do like, you know, creative tactics and so on. But INFPs are so bad at doing anything that isn't creative, even when it comes to the physical reality and so on, that like, you know, they would have a weakness, you know, that they would just be out of sync, man. You know, they would be doing better than INFJ. I had like an INFP could like hide and jump and run, and their cleverness would probably save them to a certain extent. But they would always be lagging behind and just like not being able to like kind of like integrate with themselves with the rest of the team in like a way that like a thinking type or a sensor would. And the rest of the team would be always like a little bit pissed about the INFP, always kind of going their own way a little bit and not like doing the logical choice. They would always be doing some creative choice and that kind of stuff. So then they would have to take this guy into consideration, and that would like, you know, take energy from everybody else and that kind of stuff. You know, as a sniper, I like an INFP would be like a B tier or something, but as a foot soldier, I do like INFPs would also be one of the worst types out there, but like I do they would be just better than INFJ. Like that secondary NE gives them something to a chaotic environment that the INFJ simply doesn't have. So what about the ENFP? I actually did like ENFPs would actually make for pretty feasible soldiers, to be honest. Yeah, like all of these guys being feelers and everything, they would be devastated and they would cry behind the corner every now and then. But like that's not the point here. We're talking about competence. Like how well could you shoot, run, hide, attack, you know, and position yourself and read the circumstance. Like ENFPs are leading with NE. They are leading with an explorative function. You know, the ENFPs are hyper aware of stuff happening around them. And the thing about ENFPs, they actually have a tertiary TE, which would be super powerful for being a soldier as well. That's the executional function. You're looking at the circumstance and being like, what would be logically the best thing to do here for the best outcome? So ENFPs, that NETE combo is actually quite powerful. I like ENFPs would be way better than ENFJs. You know, every ENFP that you have ever met in your life has been a complete goddamn monkey. ENFPs are some of the most clever and nimble and dexterous guys that you will meet out there. They can climb and jump and run, and they're all over the place, and they're good with their bodies, and you know, ENFPs, of all of the main intuitives, in my view, are the most capable in a physical environment. ENFPs are insanely good at like reading the circumstance and being aware of everything that is happening, and once again coming up with like creative solutions and so on. But I like ENFPs could still like work in a team as well, you know, and so on. I'm actually tempted to just put the ENFP to the A tier, you know, because ENFPs, they're so clever, they're so nimble. You know, they're so good at like reading the circumstance at that tertiary TE. You know, ENFJs, for example, only have like tertiary SE, but it's like tertiary TE. It's just as powerful for being a soldier, in my view. but then you have that NE to go with it as a main function. So I actually think that like ENFPs would actually make for feasible soldiers. And you know what? You know who was a soldier? And even kind of like a little bit of a war general doing like guerrilla warfare. It was like Che Guevara. Che Guevara was an ENFP, and he was a freedom fighter. And ENFPs actually many times get into guerrilla warfare as freedom fighters because they're willing to fight for justice. And ENFPs, like in guerrilla warfare, they are super powerful actually. But even as a soldier, like they could just like having that main NE, you know, giving you the capabilities like reading the circumstance, and that TE in like giving you executional capability. That is just like a super powerful thing for a physical environment where you have to navigate through chaos and do all kinds of stuff. So I actually did like ENFPs would be A tier. So what about the NTs? What about the ENTJ? Leading with TE, I do not like TE would be one of the best like functions for being a soldier. I like SE would be even better, but TE is a really good, like you're looking at the outside environment and you're trying to make the choice that is the best choice under all circumstance, like, you know, based on outcomes. You know, TE users, you know, like using TE, like you can even use it like to shoot. You're just looking at the circumstance and coming up with like a logical way for the best outcome. It might not be as quick and nimble and kind of like fluid as extrovert sensing is in a physical environment, but TE is still super powerful function for physical chaos and doing stuff in the middle of such environments. You know, extrovert thinking is one of the best functions for dealing with physical reality, whether it's sports or shooting or, you know, whatever you have to do. Like it's a hard-grained function. And ENTJs, they have that tertiary SE to go with it. So TESE might just be one of the greatest combos that you could have for being a soldier. It's like a really linear, you know, combo of like, you know, we're here and this is the physical circumstance and this is what I'm going to execute here for the best outcome, you know. And once again, just like with the ENFJs, the ENTJ would develop that SE, and it's a function that they can easily develop if they just get it on with it. So ENTJs would, like as soldiers, as long as they didn't die the first day, that they would ultimately like end up becoming like TESE ENTJs, who would be some of the most talented, you know, soldiers out there. That secondary NI in the hands of an ENTJ actually just like gives them another superpower in assessing the circumstance. ENTJs go with the TESE, which is like a hyper quick and physically aware function combo that is super hard-grained with reality. So ENTJ is the one type in the entire system that can derive from their NI like most out of it. Because for the ENTJ, the NI is just like working as the slave of the TESE combo in the circumstance, which, you know, ENTJs make for some of the best military generals and so on, because ENTJs can like assess the fuck out of a circumstance, you know, whether it's a physical environment or whatever, and come up with like the best strategy to do next, and do this, all of this in real time while running and being in the middle of chaos. Now, would ENTJs be S tier? That is to be debated. They would definitely be better than ENFPs. But would they be like S tier? Would they be the best soldier? Let's see. It is such a close one. I don't like, if they were S tier, they would be at the bottom of the S tier. If they were at A tier, they would be the greatest A tier guy. You know, an ENTJ versus an ENFP in war. ENFPs, they're so clever, they're so nimble, they will come up with some like creative shit. You know, one versus one circumstance, I like an ENFP actually would have a chance at it. Maybe the ENTJ would beat the guy most of the time in a team environment. I like ENTJs would be really good at like with the military strategy and moving as a team and making the best choice strategically and that kind of stuff and like positioning themselves and so on. Yeah. Well, maybe they're like they just like have to be given the S tier. Like you know, like I have watched a lot of videos about like special forces people, and there's a lot of ENTJs in like the special forces and Delta Force and these kind of guys, and they are like there's like the greatest. So like yeah, ENTJs S tier. So what about the INTJ? INTJ is leading with NI. They're super abstract. It's a super abstract function, but like INTJs, they have that secondary TE, which actually is a powerful function to be a soldier. That being said, I mean, like INTJs, they are, you know, they have an inferior SE. You know, they have a polar FE, so they are kind of oblivious to social shit, which might have some impact in them, like working as a team in a chaotic environment, taking everybody else into consideration and so on. There are some like social forces that do impact circumstances in war when you're working as a team and so on. So basically the INTJ would just be like heavily just like relying on TE alone. I actually think that like the INTJ would be the best example of like how far could you go as a soldier with TE alone. I think that like INTJs could be feasible soldiers. They wouldn't like suck at it. They wouldn't be the worst soldiers. But INTJs in a realm of chaos, you know, they would hate it. They wouldn't like it. You know, INTJs are some of the most highly strung and uptight types in the system because they are control freaks. So INTJs, I mean, they would have a very high probability of going through a complete mental, psychological meltdown because like INTJs is one of the types who is the worst at dealing with surprises and chaotic environments and all that kind of stuff. That being said, that secondary TE is super powerful, and that NI-TE combo, it just gives them like some points for strategy and so on. And that the INTJ would probably be better as a soldier than the ENFJ. But I hate to say this, and I don't know what INTJs would think about this, but I actually think that like an ENFP would probably beat the living shit of an INTJ in a state of war. Like ENFPs, they're so clever, nimble, and creative. INTJs, they're a little bit too uptight for like a war scenario to be competing with like an EP, you know. I like B tier, like I like an INTJ would be like a B tier soldier. Like they could get the job done. They wouldn't like suck at it earningly, but they wouldn't be the greatest like either. They would just be like your basic, pretty okay, yeah, soldier. That's what I would say. I wouldn't recommend an INTJ become a professional soldier. I don't think they would have any talent for it. But if you got drafted, I like an INTJ could still be feasible and be better than many other types out there. But yeah, would they be A tier? I have a hard time seeing an INTJ competing with an EP. That's what it is. You know, and NE as a main function would be so much more powerful than NI. I mean, NE would be a pretty feasible function to be a soldier, to be honest. NI would not. Okay, so that's the secondary TE going on, and it's like, yeah, I like INTJs would be B tier. So what about the INTP? So INTP is leading with TI. It does maybe give you something for being a soldier. You know, many INTPs that I know, they don't like suck at sports or anything, for example. I like INTPs can be surprisingly sporty people when they get into a hobby or something. I have never seen like an INTP like suck at it. You know, they do have like a secondary NE. So it kind of becomes a question of like, okay, so which would be better? Secondary NE or secondary TE? That's an interesting question. I think, I like an INTP would be better than an ENFJ for sure. One of my best friends of all time is an ENTP, and he does sports, and he's even like in a team in a ball game that is doing pretty well and everything, and so on. I like INTPs can be surprisingly capable in sports and everything. I like INTPs would kind of make for a feasible soldier, to be honest. That like an NESI in the middle. That means that you're basically balanced when it comes to your observations, and that tertiary SI, it's like you are closer to reality than INTJ, and that NE, observational capabilities, and so on, and then it's like being logical about it all, that like TISI combo, it's pretty hard-grained with reality, and then you throw in the NE observations. Yeah. Like I'm tempted to just like go and say, I like INTPs can be more aware of their environments than INTJs, for example. I'm tempted to say, just go and say that like an INTP would be better as a soldier than INTJ, to be honest. And INTJ is just like unbalanced when it comes to their, perception of reality with the main NI and inferior SE. Like INTPs are balanced. They have like NESI in the middle. So they're more objective when it comes to their observations about reality, and they do lead with an extroverted perceiving function. So they do pay attention to the outside reality. Would they be A tier? I'm tempted to say that they could be, but I don't know. The A tier, that's already, you got like talent for that shit. I'm not sure if INTPs would have talent for that shit. I think they would be making for feasible soldiers, and they would probably be the best of the B tier. That's what I would say. So what about the ENTP? Well, I mean, like you are leading with the NE. There's a lot of similarities with ENFPs and ENTPs. The problem with the ENTP is that like you have like a tertiary FE, where the ENFP has a tertiary TE. So while I do that, like just having NE as your main function, and it's like by being an EP, extroverted perceiver, like would make you beat all of these guys basically. Like ENTPs, they're hyper aware of environment as well. They see all the patterns and all the shit that is going on, and they can maneuver themselves. ENTPs are monkeys, man. There's no way around it. That being said, I mean, like an ENTP, man, ENFPs, that NETE combo is super powerful for physical environments. With ENTPs, you only have the NE. Like an ENTP would be a good example of just like how far could you go as a soldier with NE alone. Now, okay, that secondary TI does actually give the ENTP some capacity in kind of like, calculating the logics of the circumstance in a really fast-paced manner. I do not like the secondary TI does help the ENTP, like, to assess these physical circumstances, but that NETE combo for the ENFP, in my view, is way more powerful. I do not like, just being an EP. ENTP would be the worst EP for being a soldier, but you're still being an EP, man. And EPs for being a soldier would be super powerful, like you're completely okay with chaos, you don't get faced by anything. You're nimble, you can run and jump and hide and do all kinds of shit and assess circumstances. EPs just in general are the greatest in making situational assessments. And even as an intuitive EP, like ENTPs, they have the quickest brains in the system. The ENTP figures shit out, and they do it really fast. So I like an ENTP would still get to the A tier. They would be kind of like between the B and the A tier. They would be at the very bottom of the A tier. But I think they could kind of like the ENTPs might even have some kind of weird talent for being a soldier. simply by being an extroverted perceiver and being able to come up with shit. They could also like go with the team with their 30 FE and just like assess the circumstance well enough with their NE that they could like, you know, integrate with themselves with the team and the circumstance and the strategy. And like, yeah, I like ENTPs simply do understand their environment so well and analyze it so well that they would be able to even might have even some slight talent for that shit and so on. So what about the SJs? What about the ISTJ? Well, I mean, like you are like a sensor, like, you know, introverted sensing is the like the way fucking worst sensing function for war, but you do have it as your main function. So it's like you are living in physical reality, and that secondary TE, I like with ISTJs, that secondary TE makes that like main SI just like more powerful for like being in a physical environment and executing stuff and so on. ISTJs are kind of highly strung and a little bit uptight as people, and they don't like chaos either. And I like ISTJs could become kind of traumatized by war and so on. Now, that being said, I mean that SITE combo just like makes you so hard-grained as a guy that, like, you know, being a soldier, I mean, you should just like kind of like be better than most of the intuitives, for example, by just like being a sensor who has a heavy TE going on. The question of whether an ISTJ soldier would be beating an ENTP, that's like a question of like I like an ISTJ should be at the very top of the A tier. I know that they could get to the S tier to compete with these crazy people or these action men. But an ISTJ, they are like a main sensor and they're like an ST. You know, you would think that like they would be beating all of the other intuitives outside of an ENTJ or something. But it's like I have a hard time imagining an ENFP lose to an ISTJ. I have a hard time seeing an ENTP lose to an ISTJ because these are just clever guys. And it's like I'm probably a pretty heavy NE user myself. And I used to go and play paintball with my friends, and I was super talented with that shit. You know, and it's like let's say that I'm an ENTP, for example, which is probable. I'm not entirely sure of my type. But it's just like, I for the life of me, I don't think that I would ever lose a gun battle to an ISTJ. I'm so sorry, man. Like, I'm too clever for that shit. You know, like, I'm too good at like sneaking and hiding and doing surprise attacks and coming with like creative strategy and so on. This is like an ISTJ. They should simply lose to NE in an environment of chaos. You know, where all kinds of shit is going down and it's crazy and you have to do something and come up with some crazy stunt or something. You know, I just have to say, I'd like an ENTP would be at an ISTJ. Okay. Now, okay, that being said, I do not like the ISTJ should be at the A tier. I think they might even have some talent for that shit. But I do not like the ISTJ would be kind of like the uptight guy who would like do it, but they would lose to all of these crazy people who are completely okay with chaos and okay with maneuvering themselves. So okay, so what about the ISFJ? I have known ISFJs in my life, and they actually tend to be pretty good with like sports and that kind of stuff. I know that they suck. I'm not sure if they have like they're super talented or anything, but once again they are main sensors, you know. So that's just like, you know, you live in reality, you live in physical reality. So I think they would just be better than these guys, basically. Now, would the ISFJ get to the A tier? I don't know, man. Like ISTJs, they do have that like secondary TE to go with the SI to make it more powerful. ISFJs, they're basically just going with the SI because they don't have any other function to go with. They don't do shit with the FE. The tertiary TI maybe gives them some capacity of analyzing the circumstance, but they're like really just going with the SI. SI alone for war, for a chaotic circumstance that is physical and shit is going down and so on, I'm sorry to say, I think that the ISFJ would probably be beatier. I thought ISTJs would just be more hard-grained, better to execute things and just like cut the shits and, you know, be no bullshit and just be more competent in all imaginable ways versus the ISFJ basically. I actually do that, like ISFJs have more kind of like fluidity compared to the ISTJs, you know, because of they don't have that like linear TE function going on, but I still like overall think that it would be better to have TE, you know, still. And so I like an ISFJ would be like a B tier soldier basically. So what about the ESFJ? ESFJ is leading with FE, they don't do fuck with that shit, but they're also the kind of a type that they're a sensor and they're balanced. So they have like SINE. So which makes them like kind of like objective about their observations, gives them way more fluidity in their behavior than ISFJs, ISTJs. You know, I'm not sure if I have ever seen an ESFJ who was super talented in sports or anything, but they are still like a sensor. I thought they would probably be better than an INFP. ESFJs could imaginably have insane problems in killing people, you know, because of the SFE, and they would get traumatized and they so wouldn't want to do it, but if they would force themselves to do it, how competent would they be? I like an ESFJ by being a sensor, which should be getting to the B tier basically. I like ENFJs probably, I don't know, man. Like who would be better? I don't know, it's a tough one. It's really hard to assess. Like I have never seen an ESFJ do well in sports. You know. I think all of these guys would probably beat an ESFJ to be honest. Yeah, you know. But I know that I think the ESFJs would still be feasible as soldiers. I don't think they would have like basically any talent for that shit. But they would just be feasible. They could do it. You know, they would have to like really work on it, but they could do it. What about the ESTJ? Leading with TE, super powerful function, and they are sensors. ESTJs is the one type that can derive the most out of SI, which is not the best function for, you know, such a chaotic environment and everything, but that TENE combo makes ESTJs the most capable sensor using, like the most capable SJ for using, like being in a chaotic environment. You know, that TENE combo gives ESTJs a surprising quantity of fluidity under circumstances. They can also be kind of linear because that TESSI is super linear combo, but that tertiary NE gives them that like little bit of like fluidity and creativeness under duress. And it comes to their aids. I like ESTJs would be super talented as soldiers. There's no way around it. You know, they would make for great military commanders and so on. I think that the ESTJ would be an S tier soldier. There's no way around it. You know, they would be some of the best. I'm not sure if they would be competing with all of the greatest of the best. But they would just have to be at the S tier. I mean, like an ESTJ should be able to beat ENFPs, ENTPs, ISTJs in most of the scenarios. ESTJs, they live in physical reality, and they're the greatest at executing in the moment, and you know, just like understanding military strategy, working as a team, and doing the strategically best choice. And they have that hard-grained TESI combo, so they would be good at like shooting and everything required from a soldier the ESTJ could do, and they would be fucking nailing that shit basically. So what about the SPs? What about the ISTP? So the ISTP leading with TI, yeah, like you don't get much out of it, but that secondary SE actually turns the TI into kind of like almost like TE. I always say that like the TI-SE combo is almost like TE in practice, while getting the benefits of SE. And the tertiary NI just gives the ISTP just like a little bit of intuition for even more strategy and so on. So it's just like, you know, and SE would be the most powerful function for being a soldier. I mean, obviously the ISTP would be an S tier soldier. ISTPs are the greatest in all manner of sports, shooting, running, climbing, jumping, waging war. They are the most physically capable type in the system among a few others. ISTPs are the epitome of the foot soldier who would just beat the war and beat everybody. Beat even that of the ENTJ. You know, ISTPs would just be the greatest as soldiers, okay? And that SE is just like, that's the thing, man, okay? So what about the ESFPs? Well, leading with SE, which would be the strongest function for war. Secondary FI, okay, you don't do much with that shit, but like tertiary TE, that SE-TE combo might be the most singular, strongest two-function combo for war, just like it is for sports. ESFPs make for some of the greatest people in sports across different sports. You look at like any like the greatest like guy in this particular sport list of all time, and ESFPs are topping those lists everywhere. Obviously, ESFPs would be an S tier soldier. They would be definitely 10 times better than the ESTJ. I believe they would manhandle even ENTJs. The only question is like who would be better, an ISTP or an ESFP? You know, I follow like fighting sports. There's a lot of ESFPs who are considered the greatest fighters of all time. Muhammad Ali, for example, in UFC, you know, Anderson Silva. ISTP is the same thing. John Jones in UFC and ISTP, and there's a lot of ISTPs. Who would be better? This is like a completely impossible pick to make. ESFPs would be they would be better with people. You know, ESFPs might be just a little bit better at working in a team or something. I don't know, but they can also be kind of selfish and immature. You know, it'll be a tough competition. You know, ISTPs are the most no bullshit guys. They would cut the shit and shoot everybody. You know, yeah, this is just like an impossible, like a fully impossible shit. I would just let's just leave the ISTP as even better. But like this is like it is not better. It is at the same level of game. What about the ISFP? So the ISFP is leading with FI. You don't get much out of it. Tertiary NI. Well, I mean, you have a secondary SE. So like ISFPs are super balanced with their observations. And actually ISFPs do get that like strategy from the NI that they can bring into the physical reality, to be honest. Just like the ISTPs. ISFPs make for some of the greatest people in all sports. You know, there's so many like soccer players, for example, who are considered to be the greatest of all time, who are ISFPs. In many ball games, ISFPs are the greatest. Even in fighters, you know, ISFPs don't get into fighting as much as the ISTPs or the ESFPs, but, you know, they are still the greatest. And like an ISFP would definitely be S tier by that like SE alone. You know, ISFP is kind of like the guy where you can see like just how far can you go with like SE alone, basically. And like an ISFP should be able to beat an ESTJ. You know, that secondary SE just like makes an ISFP so powerful. There's nowhere around it. And ISFPs have that like, they can be even creative. They have that tertiary NI. And with the case of the ISFP, it gives them creativity. With ISTPs, it gives them some logical strategy. But with ISFPs, it actually gives them some like weird, fluid creativity to the physical environment. I have known, when I was a kid, I was a hyperactive kid playing outside, and many of my best friends were ISFPs, and ISFPs in sports, it's almost like a weird thing how like the SENI combo almost gives you some like, it's almost like the same as like NE or something, like not in the same way, but like the ISFPs can come up with physically ingenious ways, like in physical environment. They can come up with like ingenious ways to do shit. And I think it's also kind of like with the FI as well, there's something like, that like with FI, you get some expressional quality to things. Like ISFPs, in some weird way, I think have something more to give to an environment like this than the SE alone. I don't know how to explain it, but I like ISFPs. They're the greatest. Would they be better than ENTJ? That's the question. I like the ISFP would be the worst of the SPs, but there's still an SP, which are the greatest in war and in sports and in physical activities. Would they be better with the ENTJ? I think it would be a complete like toss up. It would be like a coin flip. I could give it to both of these guys, and I can't make the choice. So like, let's say that like the ENTJ, let's just say that these guys the same level. It doesn't matter which way these things are, because these two guys would just be just as good, basically. So what about the ESTP? Well, leading with SE, secondary TI, which once again like makes that SE powerful, and that SE makes that TI become like TE like. ESTPs are the greatest in assessing physical circumstances and mechanics of physical reality. Of course, they would be S tier. And of course, they would be even better than the ENTJ. Once again, the question of should be better, ESTP or an ESFP, or ESTP or an ISTP. I think once again, it's like an impossible decision to make. Now, at the end of the day, maybe you could get the ESTP above the ESFP, because we are talking about war where people are being killed. And you like ISTPs and ESTPs would be more okay with it because they are thinking types. ESFPs, their friends, head being blown off. I like an ESTP could be more cool about it because they have a secondary TI. So I like that is the reason why ISTPs and ESTPs would be even better than ESFPs in war. They would be marginally better, like fucking like a 1% or something. But yeah, I like ESTPs would make for the greatest soldiers and they do make for the greatest military generals and so on. There's no way around it that SE as a main function would be the strongest function for being a soldier. You see everything, you can assess circumstances, power dynamics, strengths and weaknesses of the enemy and their position and everything, and do the TI analysis on all of that. And with the tertiary FE, even take into consideration your teammates and everything, and do crazy stunts with the SE, maneuver yourself, be creative, surprise the enemy, shoot accurately. ESTPs would just be the very epitome of a good soldier. Yeah, the question is who would be better. I think it would be the same level. I like an ESTP might actually be better than an ISTP, because main SE and that FE does give you some capabilities, like an ESTP could do everything that an ISTP could do, but then they could also look at the people and understand people a little bit better, and maybe work as a team a little bit better than an ISTP. So I like the ESTP would be the kind of like ideal, perfect super soldier that has no weakness for that particular activity. They would be the greatest, and this is the tier list, guys. So there we have it, and see you in the next episodes, okay?